Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is actually the second event in our Knowledge November series of evening talks. We're not quite agreed on how many Ks there are in Knowledge November yet, but I think we're getting closer to it now. And just a quick word, just to sort of the top of the meeting, just from myself, welcome to tonight's event, which is Ash Dieback, past, present and future. So I've pulled together a slide here, which I think has broken every possible rule of slide making with different fonts and different ways to look, but just to get it all on one screen. My name's McNab Laurie from Dumfries Galloway Woodlands, a new organisation looking at trees, habitats and the people that depend on them in Dumfries and Galloway. So we're a membership organisation. If you haven't already, please do visit our website, dgwoodlands.org.uk. We've got a newsletter. You could even sign up to be a member if you're keen to support us as well, and follow us on social media. We got 3 events. Last week was Beth Bridge talking about bats, trees and farms. Massive thanks to Beth for that. A really interesting talk. That's now available on our YouTube channel. Tonight, Ash Dieback, and then next Tuesday night, Woodland History Detectives. The question you might ask is, what will you do with your Tuesday evenings when this series is over? But give us time and we'll come back. Our photo on the right there is the full team, Dumfries and Galloway Woodlands teams. It's me, Sam and Phil. And let us know if you're looking to plant native trees in Dumfries and Galloway this winter, because we've got a grant scheme and a whole range of support and advice that we can provide. And a word about our funders and sponsors that sort of cause this event to come together, which is Woodland Trust Scotland, Scottish Forestry Council. Massive thanks to Borders Forest Trust, who support us behind the scenes, and the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which has given us the grant. So you might be used to me doing a couple of minutes of cracking banter to get us started, but actually, frankly, we really don't have time tonight. We've got so much to cover, and this is a crackingly well attended event, lots of interest in the event, and I think that's probably triggered why that sort of triggers us the topic itself, because as you drive around Dumfries and Galloway, it's hard to think of a tree you see more than ash. And so what we'll be doing tonight, we've got 2 excellent speakers talking tonight. We've got Matt's going to give us a sort of background to Ash Dieback, where's it come from, and then we'll hand over to Simon, who's going to give us a bit more a snapshot of from a landowner's point of view. So if you're happy, Matt, I think, and with a nod from the tech, we'll actually hand over to Matt now. And Matt, courtesy of University of Warwick, if you're happy to give us a background and sort of how did we get where we are today, that would be much appreciated.
Yep, absolutely. So thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I'm currently a research fellow at the University of Warwick. Previously did my PhD on the ecology and pathology of Ash Dieback disease with Cardiff University and Forest Research. So anyway, I'm going to give you an overview of what we know so far and steps that we can take moving forwards. So jumping straight in, the background to the disease. So the symptoms of Ash Dieback, they were first noticed in Poland in the early 1990s. So on the next slide, there's just an image there on the right. You can see this is what they would have seen at the time. So that's a symptom of that's crown dieback there. So on the left there we have our lovely full flushing ash crown, and on the right we can see their symptoms of crown dieback. So effectively it's not, the leaves haven't flushed as much because the shoots have been killed. So it's a general sign of poor health condition in a tree, because obviously if you have less foliage, you're less able to take up nutrients through photosynthesis, and you see a general decline in tree health. So that's what they would have seen in Poland in the early 1990s. So they noticed those symptoms, and then we'll see on the next slide that we can see how it spread out from here. So it's very much a focal point, and then it spread out across the continent from this location, and the current range it extends as far west as Ireland. It goes down to northwest Spain as well now, down to Italy, Montenegro, and over to Moscow, and as far north up as Finland. I'll explain here the colours. So in the dark blue we have that's the distribution range of European ash. In the light blue in the middle, that's where European ash and narrow-leaved ash, which is another host the disease. That's where they overlap. And on the bottom shade of blue there, you can see that's just where you get narrow-leaved ash. And the disease is pretty much it's across the range now of European ash, as you can see. If we move on to the next slide, we can. So basically, like I said, the disease spread out across the continent from this focal point. So at first, was officially detected in the UK in 2012, but we know from looking at and dating historic lesions on ash that it was here at least a decade before that. And the pathogen wasn't actually identified until 2006. Prior to that, we just knew of the symptoms of the crown dieback on ash. So by the time that we'd actually identified that there was a pathogenic agent responsible, it had already spread across much of the continent, spread through a mixture of natural dispersal of the pathogen and also human-mediated transport through planting material. So we know in the UK it was introduced through a mixture of planting, and also the spores are able to disperse across the continent. But highlighting the difficulty of detecting a new agent when we don't know what we're looking for. The pathogen was actually present on the continent by 1978, so much preceding the official detection of symptoms. But that's often the case with pathogens, because they'll take some time to build up enough to actually cause disease in the host. So next, if we have a look, obviously I probably don't need to cover this too much, but the value of ash, it's an important cultural species for us, because it's been used over thousands of years, from the Roman times up until used for sports equipment these days, due to the quick nature of growth and also the strong and flexible properties of the wood. It's got high conservation value, so there's lots of species associated with it. And this actually just isn't in the UK, but say in Sweden as well, there's similar studies showing that. And in the UK specifically, we have a high proportion of ash. So we had prior to Ash Dieback, we had 13% of our broadleaf woodland was ash, roughly. So that's about 126 million trees. And then in hedgerow settings or in non-woodland settings, we were looking at an additional 60 million on top of that. So it's a lot of ash with a high conservation and cultural value. And then obviously adding those together when we're looking at what the impacts of this disease may be, that was costed to run into billions of pounds, so approximately up to 14.8 billion. But again, that's difficult to cost when we don't really know at the moment the true impact of the disease. Which I'll get onto. So, an important question to ask, obviously, the first thing, is there resistance or tolerance to the disease? And the answer is yes, there is. So, as we can see on the picture on the next slide, actually, you can see it's not a brilliantly clear image, but what you can see is it's young ash here, and on the right you can see lots of foliage, and on the left you can see one which is completely dead. So there is the strong genetic control for resistance or tolerance to the disease, and it's a polygenic trait, so it's controlled by multiple genes. So effectively, it's similar to what you'd have, say, in height, where it's controlled by multiple genes, so you get sort of a spectrum of resistance. So there's some that are highly susceptible, some that are highly resistant, and then there are a lot that are in the middle. Because if we're looking at, say, completely resistant or tolerant ash, it's only really a small percentage that we're looking at, but there's a lot in between there. And there's the markers that have been associated with disease susceptibility. They've been used to demonstrate that natural selection is in progress in juvenile ash in woodlands, which you can expect, obviously, because ash sort of regenerates almost like a weed. So then obviously with that quick regeneration, and actually as I'll get onto later, young ash is particularly worse affected by the disease. You get a really high selection pressure. So there are studies showing high after a period of time, particularly in Estonia, I think it was, or Latvia, you get a high survival of the young regenerating ash. But the mechanisms for resistance haven't been completely elucidated. And there's also evidence for interactions with environmental effects. So that's something we need to understand better, really, how the genetic control interacts with the environment. So obviously, what's the prognosis from this then? So like I said, there's a small percentage that are resistant, and then a lot sort of in the middle somewhere. Basically, the final outcome, as we can see on the next plot, there's the future is really uncertain. The bottom line is we know there's going to be a lot of mortality of ash. It's a strong disease with a high selection pressure, so it kills a lot of host. But like I said, with only a few percentage completely resistant or tolerant. But there's a lot of variation between woodlands. And then if we're projecting forwards, as you can see on the error bars there, we really don't know where it's going. And as I just said, on the left axis there, we've got the probability of death. So then, obviously, to understand that, we need to understand the pathogen. So, what is the background of this pathogen? First of all, where did it come from? So the emergence and spread pathogen, which had high mortality rate on European ash, high virulence in European ash species, indicates an invasive nature of the species. And then if we add on top of that, we have the spread out from focal point, which could obviously be indicative of, say, a genetic mutation, and so it's not necessarily an invasive species, but it's indicative of one. But then if we look at the tolerance of ash species to the disease, we see that Fraxinus ornis in Europe, which is more closely related to Asian ash, has less susceptibility to the pathogen. So that supported maybe an Asian origin for the pathogen, where it may have co-evolved with Asian ash species. And then indeed, we found that the pathogen is present in Chinese Manchurian ash, in China, Japan, Korea, and Far East Russia, where it's present, but it doesn't cause crown dieback symptoms. It survives on the foliage. And then a closer look, if we go, we can see there's the genetic evidence supports this. There's a bottleneck in the European population, and there's little genetic differentiation between populations across Europe, which also tells us that actually the populations really are connected across Europe. So we don't see strong founder effects. So the pathogen population is connected between UK and the continent, which supports it's connected via, say, aerial spore dispersal, and obviously we will have had historic movement of planted materials. And like I said before, we can get spore dispersal. Modelling shows that from the European continent to the UK. So then, if we have a bit of a closer look at the disease cycle, if we skip down, we can see here. So top left we have our ash tree. On the bottom, it's a fungal pathogen. We can see fruiting bodies of the fungus here, which is on a leaf, fallen leaf litter from the previous year. So it's on this bit here. You can see highlighted in red in the top right. So what happens? We'll start on the bottom left. We get spores dispersing during the spring and summer, and onto the foliage of ash trees. It can also infect the collar of the ash trees at the base, but we'll get onto that a bit later. Infects the foliage. There you can see some necrotic lesions on the leaves. Then it grows down into the central leaf stalk there. Then on the forest floor, then we get this black melanized leaf litter you can see at the bottom there, which basically allows it to overwinter effectively. It's resistant to degradation. Then we get the fruiting bodies forming then when the conditions are correct, and this cycle continues. So this is a sexual cycle of the pathogen, and it's really dependent on this for the infection process. So it's fundamental to understand that. So we're gonna go through this. So first of all, like I mentioned, we have the this forming of a melanized layer on the fallen leaf litter. So it's a leaf litter that's key here. This enables the pathogen to overwinter and form fruit bodies when the conditions are then suitable. So it can allow it to survive at, say, extremes where, say, if it is dependent on rainfall and moisture for fruiting, 1 year it may not have that, but then it can persist, and it can persist over multiple years. And there's evidence showing this from how it can persist in environments and how it's resistant to degradation from other fungi. However, we do find mycoparasites of the fungus, and there are antagonists for the fungus, which is promising for control. So naturally, if we skip on to the next step, actually, in the life cycle, which is the spore dispersal, so the fruit body formation. So if we skip down, we can see basically the fruit body production, like I mentioned, it occurs during the summer months, spring, summer, which is obviously adapted for the pathogen, because then that's when the foliage is out, the leaves are flushing, and it's the same in its native range as well. And based on laboratory experiments I did during my PhD, we found the threshold temperature for initiation of that development was around 10 degrees, which is sort of what we would expect there. And we did see a strong temperature gradient there influencing the development. And interestingly, in the low ash density or low infection pressure, it's because this is a sexual cycle, so you need two compatible mating partners to form the fruiting bodies. So at low ash density or low infection pressure, the disease can actually be limited by the abundance of mating partners, which may explain some of that lag phase in the build-up to actually seeing symptoms as well. And also, like I mentioned later, how some ash at lower density are less affected. But obviously, where we have ash-rich woodlands, we typically get lots of infection, and then we can see fruit body density reaching 1,300 per meter square. It's better on wetter sites and under vegetation cover. It's very environmentally sensitive. So I've had people describe this as stars in the night on the forest floor. If you have a look for little white fruiting bodies on the litter, or a more apt description is probably chickenpox on the forest floor. And then just skipping down, we can see. So during the thesis, during my PhD, I had a look at some different sites in England and Wales, monitoring this fruit body development over the season, with the help of local volunteer groups, collecting and sending samples to the lab. And then if we skip down, we can see that basically within these sites, there was a lot of variation, is what I'm saying. So, within a site and between sites, we see large variation in the fruiting body production, and obviously then you're going to get a lot of variation in the infection pressure as well. So then skipping down, we're then going to have a look at the ascospore dispersal. So then we have a spore peak in the morning, typically between 4:30 and 8:30. This again can be influenced by the environment, this time of day we typically see a dip in the relative humidity in a woodland, and that can actually be associated. The change in that humidity and changes in temperature that can be associated with changes in air pressure, which can create air currents, and then that can then potentially be the cause of triggering this daily spore release early in the morning. Because when you have fruit bodies in the lab in a box, you open the lid of the box, you get sort of change in the air currents, then you see a puff of ejection of the spores, and there's some videos online of that actually. But as well in the lab, there was a study that found that even in the lab, you found this, you saw this daily you saw this daily pattern. So it's not necessarily just environmentally controlled, and that's simultaneous dispersal helps to move the spores past objects into the air current. And then the next slide, it's just a description of how far they disperse. So, you know, for fungal spores, they can disperse massive distances. Most fall within 50 meters of a stand. You know, most fall reasonably close to the ground, but obviously you get big dispersal events as well. And the disease front, but importantly, that symptoms, when they've been monitored, they move between 30 and 70 kilometers a year. That's a symptomatic front. And then we've had dispersal estimated around 1.4 to 2.6 kilometers. And that sort of fits with the effect of neighboring ash density on a particular ash tree, which is around a few 100-meter estimate. And then again, skipping down, if we have a look at this, so again, the study sites that I used during the PhD thesis, again with the help of citizen scientists, which I'm going to get onto later, really important for tree health, monitored these spore densities and sent samples into the lab, which I then quantified via PCR diagnostics, quantitative PCR, sorry. And again, we can see there's large variation fitting with the fruit body variation within and between the different woodlands. And again, we found environmental influences on that. So, you know, moisture is very important, obviously, to build up and eject the spores. We also found a potential impacts of maybe vegetation coverage as well. So obviously under vegetation cover, you get high humidity for fruit body production, but it could be the case that may limit spore release as well, but we don't know. We need to look into that further. Although in the case of other plant pathogens, that is the case, or can be the case, sorry. I think it's rust in particular. But anyway, that's not been properly investigated. But if we skip to the next slide there, so then after monitoring the spore dispersal, we then have a look at the germination of the spores. So obviously the spores, it's fruit body produced, spores ejected. Then how do the spores germinate? So again, during the PhD, you know, had a look, and the ask spores germinate really. They germinate across a wide range of temperatures, from 5 to 30 degrees C, but we didn't find it at 35 degrees, which is what we see sort of in the growth rates. Really, above 35 degrees can be lethal for the fungus, and that relates really to what we see in disease monitoring plots, where, you know, heat wave days can actually be lethal for the pathogen, because exposed leaves can really heat up in the sun and effectively kill the pathogen and limit infection anyway. But we could see as well that from other studies that the spore germination drops when the spores have been left to dry. After a week, you can see the germination dropping there from about around 90% down to between 5 and 10%. But obviously that shows that the spores they can still germinate after a week, so they're pretty durable, and that although germination does drop, so that does highlight the potential there for long distance dispersal. But together, that tells us really that, you know, at the moment, canopy temperatures in the UK are unlikely to be sufficient to prevent spore germination, but potentially in the future with climate change or increased number of heat wave days that we've had over the past previous years, exposed foliage can heat up, and that may potentially limit the progress of the disease. And also canopy aeration may be a factor as well. But again, we need studies looking at that, not just in the lab, but in the field, looking at the effect of humidity on foliar infection. So then if we skip down onto the infection process. So hypothesize that the pathogen behavior likely depends on the spore density. We see a few different symptoms present. We can see black necrosis that we saw earlier on in the presentation on foliage, which is where the pathogen has killed the leaf tissue. So we call, but it doesn't always behave like that. It can have an extended phase, not causing those symptoms. So effectively, surviving off the, not killing the host tissue, basically living off the living host foliage. And then we look at different studies and say, you know, it can vary from a few weeks to a week. The time you see that the pathogen has killed the tissue, and then obviously from the foliar infection, then this is where we can get repeated foliar infection. Obviously causes issues, but then when the fungus progresses from the foliage down into the stem, particularly on young ash, this can be very quick. You see those sunken diamond-shaped lesions there on the main stem, and then that effectively kills the nutrient transporting tissue of the tree, and effectively girdles it and can kill it. That's on the young ash that happens particularly quickly. But on older ash, it's typically things like honey fungus that will end up actually being responsible for tree mortality in the end. The lesions can become inactive, but we don't really know the reason for that. And interestingly as well, there are other species. The Ash Dieback pathogen isn't the only species associated with ash. So there's lots of other fungi and other microorganisms that you get associated with ash as well. So there's evidence that some of those may inhibit the disease process, and some of those may also act as secondary pathogens as well and exacerbate it as well. So that's something that we really need to look into further, sort of the effect of the microbiome on this on the disease process. Then obviously, if we skip to the next slide, actually, so we can see. So I was referring to basal infection. So on the mature ash, a lot of the time, so you have the trees infected by Ash Dieback, and then we get a secondary colonizer moving in honey fungus, which is a root rotting pathogen. So actually, a lot of the time, what we see, we haven't done a systematic survey in the UK, so we don't know in the UK what the primary species causing this is, which honey fungus species, because we get multiple honey fungus species. But on the continent, it appears to be ones that are less primary pathogenic. So they act more in nature. They in non-disease woodlands, they would act to break down dead wood. But then obviously when a host becomes stressed, they can move in and they can attack this weakened host. And there's evidence actually, so the Ash Dieback pathogen can infect through the base of the trees through porous tissue. It can infect the porous tissue at the base of trees through something called lenticels, and we get these in the shoots as well in the canopy, and there's evidence for infecting there. And so we need to understand the UK what species are associated with these lesions, because it's obviously if we skip to the next slide, we can see it can become quite progressed, and then this is associated then with tree destabilization. And there's a good correlation between the states at the base of a tree and the canopy. However, actually, if we skip to the next slide, we can see that it's not always an exact correlation. So it's important, obviously, canopy is a good way to assess a tree, but it's important, obviously, to look at the states at the base of a tree as well, because that was actually the crown of this tree. Because we can, it's a correlation between the presence of basal rot in the trees and the canopy condition, but it's not an exact correlation. And then if we skip to the next slide, so then obviously that's outlining some of the disease progress there, and this will then help understand some of that variation there. So if we skip down, so that was outlining it sort of in a process-based way. But then if we look at what we've actually found from studies looking at large-scale studies looking at different factors associated with the disease, which we don't actually have in the UK, because we don't really have that large data set to do the study. But say from Swiss study, we can see how important moisture was, 85% higher mortality probability since disease arrival in sites classified as wet. Temperature, so higher temperatures associated with worse disease until we get to very high temperatures like you see in the south of France or heat wave days. So maybe in the future, if we get more heat waves, that will be associated with disease alleviation. Then host age is really, really vital. So the young ash, they're killed, can be killed very quickly. And we get a really much slower rate of disease progress in the mature ash for the reasons I outlined before. And trees that were more vigorous, growing prior to the disease arrival, they actually, they actually fare much better. So they have more nutrient resource to then respond to the infection. Host density, unsurprisingly, is a really important factor. Obviously, if you've got higher host density, you get a higher number of that infected foliage on the floor, and you're going to get more spore density, more fruiting, and more infection. And then obviously soil type is important, and flushing can be important. So a later flushing can be associated with greater crown damage. And like I said before, there are other microorganisms living on the ash that have been associated with disease tolerance. And so then, from all that information, what next? So if we have a skip down, we can see sort of summary of where we can sort of go from here next. So, like I mentioned before, a lot of those studies they're from the continent, but really, the next steps, because obviously what we get asked a lot is, what to expect. And as I highlighted before, there's a lot of variation and uncertainty. But what we really need is systematic survey data in Britain to inform us on the status of the disease in different locations, how severe it is. So then we can actually model scenarios that will then inform management strategies, because we can build models from the European data, which is what I did for my previous project here at Warwick. And then we can look at different scenarios on how it might progress in different woodlands, which would be useful, obviously, to inform management strategies and how likely it might be to progress. But obviously, to get a more accurate picture of the scenarios, we need validation data in Britain. And as I mentioned there's obviously natural selection. We have the potential to roll out resistant ash in the future. But there's, like I said, understanding of how it works in nature with environment interactions and also other future pests, such as emerald ash borer, which I'll get onto next, which is a beetle which affects ash. And then, as I highlighted, there's potential biological control agents. There's viruses that are associated with the pathogen, and there's one from a virus actually from its native range in Asia, which can be associated, not all the time, but can reduce virulence of the pathogen. And then there's other competing antagonists. And we obviously have resistance inducers as well, so you can treat young saplings with particular chemicals or with other biological agents, which then can lead to greater disease resistance in ash. But obviously, there's not going to be necessarily a single solution to the problem. But if we have quantitative models of how the different steps of the pathogen life cycle, then we can actually have a look at how different interventions, if they don't necessarily eliminate the fungus or the pathogen, but they reduce certain aspects of the life cycle, we can quantify what might be effective, what might not be effective, and sort of go from there. But the key thing there is obviously we need to trial things out in the field now, because obviously we've been doing a lot of catching up and with the pathogen. So if we move on to the bigger picture, so here on the left you can see there's a plot of invasive pests and pathogens. Basically, we've been having an increasing number, and it's associated really with an increase in the plant trade, and this can transport pests and pathogens around the globe, which I think Simon's going to talk a bit about next. But things like Xylella, which might decimate the olive industry. That was, I believe, from someone, or it was from a coffee plant from Costa Rica. I think there's a paper on that. But then there's, like I mentioned, there's a beetle that affects ash. So you speak to anyone in the United States about ash, and it will be concerns over this beetle, emerald ash borer beetle, because it's killed millions of ash in the United States. But we're preparing for that and potentially trying to pick it up early if it does arrive, because it's on the European continent, so it's as far west as Kiev now. but we've been having a proactive research response to make sure that we're on the front foot. So project I was doing here at Warwick in collaboration with other partners, which was got a catchy name. It's finished now, but it's called the Smarties Project. But it was basically we're looking at scenarios to detect emerald ash borer as early as possible through likely entry points, and then I was looking at the interaction with Ash Dieback disease and modelling different scenarios of how it might influence the spread of the beetle and how that might affect the detection as well. And there's also research going on, forest research to do with control agents that could be used potentially. So you get parasitoid wasps, things like that, and people examining host resistance as well. So it's very much a proactive research response there. And that really highlights as well, with an increasing number of invasive pests and pathogens, that we need to, we need to understand how a future pest or pathogen might affect our trees. We need to understand, the current state of our trees as well. So, ash dieback, how that affects the state of our ash, and then we can have a look at how emerald ash borer might influence things. And to help solve this problem, it's a bit of a needle in a haystack problem to detect things early. So we've been doing work here at Warwick on that in collaboration with partners at Forest Research, and how basically, looking at sensitivity of visual detection and methods to quantify that, because that influences, how interpretation of data basically. But there's online resources available, Forest Research Observatory, among other places, for people to have a look at different pests or pathogens to be looking out for, and they can be reported via the Tree Alert webpage. But yeah, public help with these things, engagement is really important to pick these things up as early as possible, because it's a bit of a needle in a haystack problem. And then next slide, if there's further details on Ash Dieback as well, so in a recently published review, if feel free to read that and get in touch with any questions. And finally, thank you for listening. So hopefully I didn't rush over all of that too quickly. If there's any questions.
Thank you, Matt. I think it's fair to say there was quite a lot in that, wasn't there? That was incredible. That was absolutely incredible. Can I ask, just going to be chairman, just ask a quick question: do you remain optimistic with things? I mean, there's quite a lot in there that is relatively head in hands stuff. Do you remain optimistic that lines all going up on the charts and things? So we're going to be able to respond to this?
So yeah, I mean, it didn't help that it's very much a reactive response, because, like I said, the pathogen was already it was already here really before we officially knew what the pathogen was. But yeah, I mean, I would say undoubtedly a lot of ash are going to die. It's a lot of work then, for example, to monitor these trees, and particularly along roadsides or public access areas for safety. But the positive side is there's a lot of environmental variation there. So if I go to an ash woodland and it's ash rich and it's a moist site, it's a wet site, then that's typically going to be a badly affected site. But if it's a low ash density, like in a hedgerow tree, it has a much higher chance of doing well. We don't actually know what the final outcome is going to be. So maybe that is a positive thing, that we can't, we're not going to say 95% of ash are going to die. We don't know, but there's a strong influence in the environment, and there's a spectrum of resistance. So it depends on where the tree falls on both of those things as to how it's going to react to the disease. Then on top of that, at the moment, although it's a reactive research response, we're discovering potential biological control agents. How those then next thing after identifying agents is then to be able to test them in the field. Then obviously resistance breeding programs, things like that. So longer term, I mean, a lot of ash are going to die, but it's not like it's not a closed book
for the species. No, absolutely no. And there's a question you might probably like not to answer this, Matt, but there's a question that's come in about the potential of us selectively breeding our way out of this with UK stock. And is that something that you hold up as as a particular hope that we can just through selective breeding we can get.
Yes, I mean there is natural selection in the woodlands. So yeah, in a way, so yeah, that's a bit I didn't add to the previous response, was that, you know, over a period of time that there will be selection there. There is evidence for that in the markers, in genetic markers. So particularly because ash regenerates almost like a weed, so, you know, it happens very quickly. So, you know, there will be natural selection. There is potential, yes, for breeding. However, we're trying to do that at a coordinated European scale, because the important thing with future threats to trees, we don't know what may arrive next, what might not. We're trying to preserve as much of the genetic diversity as possible. Yeah, so that's why people from all countries across Europe are out there collecting and identifying as many resistant ash as possible.
Absolutely fascinating to think of people in America concerned about ash, but for a totally different reason than we are here.
Yes.
So immediately, that's a learning point in itself. This is not a global problem just yet. Brilliant. Right. So there's lots of questions that come in. Simon's actually done a double shift tonight. He's been answering quite a lot of questions that come in. I don't know, Matt, if during the presentation maybe you'd want to jump onto the chat and answer any of the questions that come in as well, if that's possible. But I think, mindful of time, we'll come to any outstanding questions afterwards. I wonder, Simon, follow that probably is the comment that comes to mind, because what we've had there is the background of the arrival of ash and trying to get the Ash Dieback and trying to get a handle on an intangible, trying to nail custard to a ceiling in many ways in terms of identifying and responding to it. But it'd be really interesting to hear a landowner perspective on that. And so it's so great with your role with National Trust for Scotland. It'll be very good to hear from you, Simon. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, McNab. Good evening, everybody. I can't actually see you tonight, but I've had some nice chats with people so far. So off we go. As McNab said, my name is Simon Jones, work for National Trust for Scotland. And I'm just going to actually give you a little bit of a deep delve into some other pathogens, as well as focusing on Ash Dieback, because without a doubt, folks, my job and working in the west coast of Scotland, I deal with so many pathogens. It just seems to be what I do every day, which can be rather depressing. But to comment on the comment that was just made there by McNab and Matt, there is hope. There definitely is. So off we go. Next slide, please. So this is just a little quote I always use whenever I give any presentation, because it just keeps me very well grounded. So that's a Theodore Roosevelt quote. And I think it's very apt for the Trust, because it's an organisation that has a charter with the people of Scotland, and we're charged with caring for our cultural heritage. Thanks. For those that don't know the Trust, it's a big organisation. It's spread throughout the whole country. We own lots of different things. We own Munros and islands and castles and design landscapes and natural heritage, coastlines, all manner of different things. So there's an awful lot to us as a charity, which means it's very complicated for us to look after things. This is where my office is in Greenbank Garden. This is in East Renfrewshire in Glasgow. Next slide. I'm very privileged to work there. Just to introduce you to the management team who I work with. So the 6 people, including myself here, and we're the Gardens management team for the Trust. That's our curator on the right there. Our head of gardens is Anne Steele. And then there's 4 people like myself, gardens managers, and we look after 38 design landscapes across Scotland. You can skip this one, actually, it's really boring. No one wants to see a blobogram of a department. So this is the region I look after, south and west, which is the big blob on the bottom left of the screen on the map. I'm also advisor to Inverewe from time to time, and I live in Fife. So suffice to say, there's a lot of driving that I do. When I'm out and about driving, you kind of see some strange things like this. Which is just a piece of artwork in the landscape. This is in St Fillan's in Strathearn. On a wet, windy day, it looks like that. On a lovely dry, calm day, it looks a bit like that. So just to share that with you folks, because I spend a lot of time in the car. Now, when I'm thinking about my role in managing trees, don't worry, I'm not weird. These are my children. When they actually liked me, now they're teenagers and can't stand me, but that's another story for another day. But the most important thing for me is, what do I do as a gardens manager? My role is as a stewardship of the land. So when we're managing trees, slide. What I'm looking for and what we're in the business of is trying to get trees from a very young age to a very old age, which is an easy thing to say, but practically it's actually quite a difficult thing to do for all sorts of different reasons. But the trees that we tend to have in NTS design landscapes is you name it. It is a world collection of trees. On the left-hand picture there, you can see beautiful Serbian spruce, Picea armorica, and this is Happy Valley in the Culzean estate, the wider estate, which is dominated by North American species. So there's a whole rich tapestry of tree species from all around the world grown in our gardens in Scotland. None more so beautiful than these oaks at Culzean. This is a perfect example. I use this in other talks when I'm doing tree survey teaching, but this is a perfect example of what's called thigmomorphogenesis, which is basically a tree's ability and its adaptability to environmental pressures like wind. These are coastal trees that are twisted and gnarly. Next slide. We have many native pathogens, and Matt kindly touched on some of them. Honey fungus is prevalent one. Slide. This is in our Dooney garden. This was a rather large cupressus that had a butt rot fungus called Phaeolus schweinitziae, Dyer's mazegill, and that snapped out. You can see the size of the tree in relation to the head gardener there. Next. This is on a beech tree, bacterial canker, could even be Phytophthora. Next. And this is the fruiting bodies of a different species of honey fungus. This is Armillaria ostiae on a sycamore. Next. And if you get your eye in and look very, very closely, you'll see tiny little Ganoderma brackets on this Picea. If you ever see these little brackets on a tree, it's better if you see a big one. When there's little ones, it means they're running out of food, which means the tree's likely to snap out. So these are just native pathogens that we get in our trees all the time. Things like this is the early stages of beech bark disease. This is when it's infected by a sap-sucking insect, and that quickly moves on. And beech trees are actually one of the ones that I have to deal with quite a lot. I know we're going to come to ash in a wee second, but there's so many mature beech and so many stately homes all around the country. This one in particular is colonised by 3 pathogens. There's beech bark disease, Ganoderma, and Cryptsmeria. And reading the text there, what you find is that the beech bark disease dries out the tree, the Ganoderma likes it wet, so they almost cancel each other out a little bit. But the winner will be the Cryptsmeria, which is a cinder fungus, which eats cellulose and lignin, so it's going to cause the tree to fall down. All native pathogens that old trees invariably get, which is why it's actually quite difficult in a design landscape, a garden, where it's artificially been created by humans to get these trees into this veteran state. But what I have to focus on an awful lot, which is what I said at the beginning of the presentation, is actually invasive non-native species. In the top left here, you can see some skunk cabbage, and top right, some skunk cabbage, Lysochiton, and some Rhododendron ponticum in the bottom right, which actually came in from Turkey quite some time ago. Next slide, please. The Phytophoras are one that I deal with perhaps more than other species, and the picture on the left hand side here is a Nothophagus, which is slowly being colonized by a Phytophora called Pseudosyringae, which is specific to actually Nothophagus alpina is what it likes, but it's actually going for the Stombiae as well. And the images on the right there are the classic sudden oak death, which is rife up and down the west coast of Scotland, affecting large trees, and that's Phytophora ramorum. One of the gardens I look after in the west coast called our Dooney garden, just south of Oban. All the sort of pink-hued trees you can see there are Japanese larch. That's Larix camphori. And this 20-acre garden was dominated by over 1,000 larch trees, which were hit with what's called a statutory plant health notice. And we had to fell over 1,000 trees in a 4-year period. And this is the result of what happened to that garden. So move on another slide, please. And you can see from an aerial shot there how many logs and trees have been stacked up. What I'm actually most impressed with, to be honest with you folks, I give an hour and a half talk on this one project and how we did it. But what's heartening for me is how many trees we managed to keep standing in this process. Moving on, please. Other things that we're having to deal with is golden root mealybugs, a little mealybug that came in from New Zealand. It's an indiscriminate little pest, eats the roots of any host it comes into contact with, particularly likes Mechanopsis, which is blue Himalayan poppies, and primulas. So in a lot of our west coast gardens, which are quite known for those two plants, as herbaceous plants, are all having to be removed because we just can't live with the lack of vigor. So that's a genuine problem. It has no biological control, no way of getting rid of it. So it just munches roots as it goes. Red band needlebright's been in the UK since the 90s. That's beginning to chew pines, basically. It's a notifiable pest within the nursery trade, but not in a landowner situation or private gardens. So we just have to respond to that. We had one incidence in a Pinus thunbergii in Kirkcudbright recently, another one in a Pinus nigra in Holmwood in Glasgow. So both those trees were felled just as precautions. So there's a massive list, folks, of pest and diseases and plants that are on the naughty list, as I call them. We've been dealing with them for many years. It's not new that we have these new pathogens coming from other places. I would say that it's the movement of plants and people that are invariably, this globalized way in which we do things has definitely accelerated the pace in which these pathogens are artificially colonizing our land in an accelerated rate. Next slide. None more so than not in the UK at the moment, and I think Matt touched on this, which is Xylella fastidiosa. It's come over from Costa Rica. The vector was an insect. The list you can see on the right hand side. I remember when that was only about eight plants long. That's host plants or plants that can be infected by it. And there was only one species of Xylella. I think there's now 4 or 5 subspecies, and the list of host plants and plants that can get affected by it is as long as your arm. It's huge. Next slide. Just as a worked example of how things can move artificially within a landscape, this is the horse chestnut leaf miner, Camerera oridella, which is a little leaf miner that has come from Lake Ohrid in Macedonia. Slide, please. And this is the impacts it has. So anybody that's been down south or even just in England now, it used to be the case many years ago that it was down in Devon and Cornwall and Kent, Somerset, those sorts of areas. Now it's spread right up to Northumberland, and I believe it's just in the edge of Scotland. That might not be quite accurate as I speak, but the problem is it mines the leaves, creates the opportunity for a secondary infection. Next slide, please. And from this slide, you can see where it originated in Macedonia, or North Macedonia as it is now, and within decades quickly spread to the UK. Slide. And you can see that it has landed in London. Now, the interesting thing about the spread of this is that it didn't move at a steady ecological pace, as Matt says, through an environment. It ended up in city to city all through Europe. And they'd figured out that the leaf miner was actually getting pulled along by freight lorries. Therefore, it was landing in cities. You can see that the hotspot in this slide here was in London before it was on the landscape. So again, it's evidence to show that globalization, that movement of an accelerated movement of freight and goods actually causes some ecological impacts within our tree collections. Slide. There is a new kid in the block, folks. There's a new Phytophthora. This is Phytophthora pluvialis, which particularly likes hemlocks and pines. So this is in Benmore Botanic Garden. The black lesions you can see on the stem is a symptom of it. To look at the tree from a distance, you can barely tell anything's wrong with it. It's only when you get a little bit closer you realise how sickly they begin to look. The image on the right-hand side is actually a spore counter from World War II, which is what they used to see if there was any gases or fungal biological weapons used. And it's basically just reverse sticky back plastic, and it collects the spores. They take the capsule out, and then they see what's living on it. Slide. So onto the topic at hand. Just wanted to give you that background, because although we're in the landscape from a landowner's point of view, we're dealing with so many different things. Ash is just one of many, and the things that I've been talking about, you can see that in our Dooney garden, that's that whole garden completely destroyed by that one pathogen in that one tree. We have to replant. That'll take 50, 60 years for that garden to recover from that devastation. So Ash Dieback is one of many that we're dealing with, and all, you could argue, in different instances are equally as important and equally as destructive as each other. Slide. But what we tend to see, and Matt touched upon this as well, and what I've noticed is older trees, a little bit more mature, 80 plus, they seem to be able to hold on for a bit longer before the different stages kick in. The younger trees with less vigor, less vitality, more vigor and more vitality because they're young, are succumbing much quicker to the pathogen. Slide. For those that don't know, these are the 4 stages of Ash Dieback. Class 1, you can see there's almost pretty much full canopy, almost no dieback at all. You'd have to really get your eye in to see that. You can see as it progresses through to classes 2, 3, and 4, it's getting progressively worse. Now, the problems from a garden owner point of view, domestic, commercial, landowner point of view, is when do you take action? At the beginning, when this first was beginning to get a foothold in certain areas, people were climbing trees up into class 3. Then they're realizing that the integrity of the wood is not quite there. A few accidents occurred, and then they've pulled back from that. So I still have a tree surgeon that will climb trees for me in class 1 and 2, but when it comes to class 3 and 4, it's a different operation altogether. I'll come to that in a second. So within the National Trust for Scotland, it's a case of managing risk. Slide, please. And you know, the National Trust is kind of like government versus and government and local authority. And by that I mean we have our HQ function that exists in Edinburgh, and then we're divided into regions, which is kind of like our councils. So there's a lot of you know, we're spread geographically across the country. But something like ash, something like pathogens, you know, they don't do politics. They cut across everything. It just infects plants and landscapes. So it's really important that you know, the different gardens managers in the organisation, we all pull in the same direction. Slide. So what we have is a fairly robust structure set up. So we have what's called our tree safety policy, and this isn't necessarily just a risk assessment. It's a little bit different to that. We look at it from what we call usage zones. So all our landscapes are divided into usage zones, and they're based on the frequency of how they're used. You know, do people gather there? Are they used for events? How many people come and frequent it? Are there any people in there at all? Because some of our outer policies, which is the edges of the big landscapes, they have no people at all. So what this is it's risk based, but it's making sure that we don't over survey. The thing about trees, folks, is the more you look, the more you find. And if you're sorry if there's any consultants on the line here, because that's their job, is to look for things and to do the surveys and make sure we're all safe. But it's like anything, you know, that's what tends to happen. The more you look, the more you find, the more work you do. And what we did in the trust was just challenge that and say, well, do we actually have to do that? So we don't survey our trees as frequently as what we used to. The consistency comes because we need to ensure that if an ash tree in Pitmeaden Garden that's next to a road that's used fairly frequently, and an ash tree in Thrieve Garden next to a road is both given the same treatment. In other words, it's given the same usage zone, the same risk, and we'll look at it in the same way. Dwell time is also brought into it as well. You know, are people dwelling in the picnic spaces or just for walks with dogs, all these different things. And that actually dictates how we manage our trees in general, and specifically our ash. Because if I refer to one of my original slides, we're in the business of keeping trees up. So as much as we possibly can, even if they do have Ash Dieback or a whole host of other pathogens, if they're not going to cause anybody any harm, then why touch them at all? Just leave them. Slide. So this is just, I'm not expecting you to read this. It's just an example of the survey work. That's just a grab of a spreadsheet. The bottom one is actually just in relation to one of the questions that was asked earlier on, is where do we find resistance? Matt very eloquently spelled out the origins of the pathogen. Where it comes from seems to be Asian. So I'm looking at North American species or any varieties to see if there's any resistance within that. And this is just pure anecdotal stuff, me knowing my trees and the gardens I look after, and then just observing, getting the head gardeners to observe what's going on. Just an example of some of the work that we do in Pitmeaden Garden. So we've had certain areas completely mapped out. So all the ash are completely mapped as a separate exercise to just general tree surveying. Bearing in mind, we have hundreds of thousands of trees. And what we've done is map out all the ash, look at their ages of trees, the classification, how far along they are in their Ash Dieback's journey, and then what action needs to be taken. And that means that we're able to, work this up into a bigger business case to make sure that the bosses have enough money to be able to afford these trees to come down. And that's just another example of it. So it's just mapped out across the north part of the garden. Slide. So with all this information, when you present it to the powers that be, you say, well, if this is how much it's going to cost if we do something now. This is what's happened here. We've got pest and disease all around us. We need to take action constantly. So I often feel I'm completely backed into a corner. Slide, please. But it's a well-known fact. The price of inaction is far greater than the cost of making a mistake or or just being complacent with these things. And it's estimated, which is not far off. I'm pleased Matt and I are roughly on the same page. It's billions of pounds it's going to cost. I mean, whether it's 12 to 15 billion, it doesn't really matter. They have inherent ecosystem services that. Which is where these figures often get calculated from. There's the figures from actual felling of trees, which is several billion, to what do they actually give to the UK in terms of ecosystem servicing, which you can calculate into these figures too. Slide, please. So if we, in my experience, when we act quicker, so if a tree is next to a house, a roadside verge, you can see that it's got stage 1, stage 2 dieback, and that's when I think you need to take action. You know that the tree is going to die, so it's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years, maybe a bit longer, depending on its age. You know it's got a high value target in the road or the house or a power line or something like that. So in the event of that failing, you can foresee the likelihood of this causing injury to somebody. So action needs to be taken. Do it in stages 1 and 2. You may get somebody to climb it. If you don't do it in stages 1 and 2, the cost, you can add another 0 or a couple of zeros onto it because you're looking at more of what's going on in the right-hand image. It's going to be operations work platform or even bigger, like this piece of kit here. Once you get into those realms, that you might have road closures, all sorts of different things, services planning, lots of different factors come into it. So it just becomes more and more and more costly.
Are you there, Simon? We might have lost you at a critical moment. Simon? No problem. I wonder if Simon's briefly left the room. I wonder if I could just put a couple of these questions to Matt, just while Simon rejoins.
Yes, I was just typing it out.
Oh, brilliant. I'll save you typing there. There's a question come in about plant trade, international plant trade, and is this in a world of unsimple solutions, Matt? Is there a simple solution that presents itself here about clamping down on the international transfer of plants? Does that come up in your discussions at all?
So I mean, I think a lot of it is raising awareness for the problem as well. So, for example, it's quite normal for people to buy seed from different places or transport, ornamental plants from one place to another, or have exotic plantings of things.
But I could buy rhododendron on eBay tonight that will be shipped to me from China. It feels like there's an easy win there in terms of
So it's I think like I highlighted before, there's there's an endless list of those things that have been introduced through movement of plant material, and then, like I said, with Xylella to Italy, is introduced through a coffee plant from Costa Rica. So again, those things are just so easy to move from one place to another. And I think I don't necessarily think a lot of people are aware. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think there is necessarily big public awareness of the susceptibility of potential risks of doing that, of moving plant material from one place to another.
Yeah. So you were saying there's a bit more carrot rather than stick possibly could still be required.
I think outline. I mean, sorry, I don't know if you want to jump back to the presentation, but I'll just sorry.
No, it's good. Very good. I was just going to wrap up there, but so Simon, we lost you briefly, but I think you're back in the room. No, I don't think it was a personal decision by yourself. That's fine. But I think we could probably jump back to where we were in the presentation.
Thank you.
That's happy.
Where did you lose me? Was it on this slide?
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. So apologies about that, folks. IT gremlins. It's probably my daughter using all the internet. So on this slide here, what I was talking about was basically is there any resistance within any varieties. And I think I mentioned in the chat to somebody that this pendulous form here, and the whole canopy was dead, so we monolithed it. And again, if health and safety dictates, if you can do this, that is something I would suggest is just monolith the trees rather than fell them to ground level. At least then they've got some wood and the chance to throw in some new growth. And we've noticed that this monolith pendulous thing is quite happy. It just keeps producing it. There is some dieback on the new stems, but by and large, the tree is still alive. And that's after its whole canopy was dead. Slide. So the practical steps that we need to consider, because there are a lot of limitations to doing tree work just in general. So by no stretch am I suggesting you go out and just begin to hack bits of trees off, or of any disease plant. Just you have to go through certain steps. So the first thing I'd recommend is make sure you know where your house is, where your property is. Is it in a conservation area? Is there a tree preservation order? There may be land ownership issues and require planning for certain things. You need felling permissions if it's over a certain tonnage, which you would get through Nature Scot. There may be surveys that have to be done from an ecological point of view for any protected species. If the tree exists within an area that has a long-term forest plan, that changes the legislation again, because that's an agreed plan. Practically within gardens themselves, or within land that's controlled as a designed landscape, then biosecurity, quarantine facilities are quite important for the movement of plants. I think the chat that I missed out just a second ago was about the movement of plants all across the world. You know, something that gardens are, you know, for all intents and purposes, have been the root of all evil for many years, and I'd be the first to admit that. But it's something that we are looking at as an organisation, and there is a collective movement to improve the quarantine facilities. Record keeping is incredibly important. Plant passporting within the trust is important for when we produce plants and give them to another garden. Slide, please. There are plenty of organisations to look at for best practice. There are Arb Association, Forest Research, Forestry Contracting Association is a very good one, very practical. Tree Council, what was Forestry Commission in Scotland, which is Scotland Forestry and Forestry and Land Scotland. And from a practical health and safety point of view, then FISA is a good organisation to look at, which gives you all sorts of things. There are many specialist companies, too many for me to name, but these are some of the people that I've certainly worked with and know of in the industry. So, you know, forgive me, I can't remember the chap's name, lovely guy that owns Ayrshire Tree Surgery, bought an enormous kit, and we saw it demoed in Glasgow, which was fascinating to see, the biggest chipper I've ever seen. But for mapping and surveys, there's lots of different people out there, and there's just a few. So maybe if the slides are available, you can get that information afterwards. Again, it's just evidence just to show you. There's the Arb Association, so there's information from their website. Next one, please. And the same goes for the Tree Council. Next slide, please. In terms of further support, I've just put I thought it would be quite helpful for people just, you know, to look at any invasive species. You can go on the EPO website, which is European Mediterranean Plant Protection Organisation. All you need to do for that is go on the website, pop in your species, and it will tell you what it's host to and how to deal with it. Species of pathogen, that is. And there's some government guidance there, some tree felling permission guidance, and other websites related to just ash, best practice, plant health, how to notify anybody or get advice. There's plenty of information there for folks. In terms of tree selection, this will invariably come up, and I think it came up in the chat just a little bit, where we look at, well, if ash are disappearing, if we've lost horse chestnuts and are beginning to go, we've lost elms for whatever reason, we're losing ash, and these are climax species within within the UK flora. So what's next? Well, you'll be pleased to know that this is where the hope comes in. There's a lot of very clever people out there, none more so than the people that have designed the iTree system, which is mechanisms for understanding and assessing trees and making sure they're suitable for location. It is unbelievable how many street trees get planted native street trees in the UK, native trees that you use in the streets, 15 to 20 degrees difference, they all burn and crisp. I'm sure you've seen it many times. Bircham trees have developed a system where they look at the carbon sequestration properties of the tree as it matures. So you're able to make an informed choice about what that will do. And there's much more information now from forest research about carbon mitigation, carbon loss from tree species. Slide. Here's another one here. This was written by a very, very good guy at Myerscough College called Andy Hirons, and that's just tree species for that green infrastructure. That's basically looking at what trees would work in an urban environment. This is a really interesting one, actually, which is if you're wanting to do native, or you're wanting to look at what trees we should be planting in light of a changing climate. Do we just let things go? What do we do, basically? So Forest Research developed this tool. It's called the Ecological Site Classification. And basically, all you have to do is pop in your postcode, and that area will pop up with all the trees that would be suitable for you to plant in the next 20 to 50 years, in their opinion. So it actually is monitoring what's happening with climate shift in the UK and recommending what to plant, which is a very handy website. Slide. But to begin to end on positive note and positive chat, trees are incredibly resilient. They're very robust. They are supposed to have multiple pathogens. That is what they are. They're giant living organisms that are host to many, many different things. I love this photograph because if you look closely, you can see that two branches have fused together, and this tree was going to split apart, and it's fused and branches all the way around its crown, which has given it enormous strength and enormous support, just by that lovely biological natural thing happening. So they are very tough. And I want to end just with a little bit of a thought-provoking slide. So I was going to show lots of photographs here, but then I thought, you know what, let's just put this out to the floor, because if we accept the fact that the movement of plants, people, substrates, increase in pathogens in our native flora. We've just talked about trees. We haven't touched about herbaceous plants, aquatic systems, anything like that. Then is there an opportunity for us as people to come together and say, well, what trees should we be planting in the future? Now, I've said that gardens can be the root of all evil. That is true. We do collect an awful lot of plants from around the world. Some of those plants have escaped and moved into the wider environment, like Rhododendron ponticum. And it's such a shame because there's only one or two rhododendrons that have this really invasive tendency. There are thousands of rhododendron species that don't. But bringing this back, should we have, and I'll put this to everybody, a progressive attitude towards what trees we plant in our landscapes? In other words, is there an opportunity for us to experiment with non-native trees to look at which ones have invasive tendencies in our climate, and will they be suitable in our environment? Now, this isn't something new. This has happened in the 1930s. There was forest gardens created in Scotland. Creray has one. There's Kilmun. There's Leal. I can't remember the fourth one. And they were experiments between 1932 and early 50s, looking at suitable replacements for the forestry industry. Now, they're all still evident, and this forest garden, one of the ones I look after, Creray, has 220 different plots of different species of trees from all around the world, and they're still growing there just now. None of them have escaped into the wider environment, and they're happily just sitting there as giant compartments of foreign trees, and they're there. We can look at them. So I'm just going to put that out there to everybody to have a think, and this is a classic example of the forest garden. These are giant mounds of polytrichum with Atlantic hazel. That is a native plant, but they wanted to see its timber value. It's long since gone as any sort of experiment. And that is me, folks. So happily take questions. And have a
Brilliant.
debate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Simon and Matt. That was absolutely fascinating. Simon, I'd love to just pick up on a comment you made in reply to one of the questions asked, which was not knee-jerk like we did with elm. And do you think there's an element of a learning point that we've made there, do you think, between elm and Ash Dieback?
I'd like to think so. I mean, I think we're not knee-jerking our way into felling every single ash tree in the UK. So there's a learning point. We did do that with Dutch elm, and the thing that we missed out on with Dutch elm is a simple biological thing for the beetle. The beetle needs mature bark to burrow its way into. So if we had coppiced a lot of the elm and went into a management regime of coppicing and kept the bark young, there's no place for the beetle to go, so it'll naturally die out. That's what we've had to do with golden root mealybug, Meconopsis. We in areas where we have infections, we take away the food source for that particular pathogen, and it just dies out naturally. So I don't know the science whether that would be right or wrong, but in my logical brain, it would make sense to not knee-jerk, to understand the biology of both the pathogen and what it's attacking, to make more informed decisions.
Yeah, we wonder whether we've learned something between the two issues, but there's been a bit of a considered.
Yeah, well, I think because the part where I say no to that, McNab, is when we look at responses to sudden oak death to Phytophthora. So, the garden I looked after was issued with a statutory plant health notice to remove all the larch. Now, this is a wind-borne, water-borne pathogen that it wouldn't matter whether I removed the trees or not. It's going to spread through the landscape. So perhaps there was other reasons for those trees to come out, which, I'm straying into politics, so I'll dip out of that now. But that is a knee-jerk reaction as far as I can tell. So are we learning? Are we not? It depends on the motives behind the decisions.
Cool. There's a question that's come up here about uses of ash, and there's a great comment about in ash built antique cars and authentic cars and things. But obviously, the question that comes up that I get a lot is, can I use it for firewood? And I suppose, do you have any considerations from a landowner point of view, Simon, about uses of ash, or is it is everywhere now?
It's everywhere. I mean, it doesn't come under the same legislation as other infected plants. So I come back to Phytophthora ramorum. That has a whole set of guidance around, once you have an infected site, what you can and can't move out of it. Can you move infected trees? Can the trees be milled? All that sort of different things. So I don't think there is that with ash or infected ash. It's just fell the trees. So I certainly use it for firewood.
Yeah, brilliant. There's a question coming in about monolithing. I think I might have heard of the word monolithing before, but can you give a definition of monolithing?
I do apologise, folks. So that's basically, if you imagine a lovely, big, beautiful tree, you collapse the canopy, you take all the canopy away, and you leave a singular trunk. And the singular trunk can be about, say, 5-6 meters tall, something like that. They tend to stand up for about 10 years, and then eventually they'll rot off at the base and they'll fall over. But monolithing, something like ash, will just give it the opportunity to produce some regrowth, and you never know, it might pull through from that. Who knows?
Yeah. I was slightly alarmed by the class 1 definition, because I walk past an ash tree and think, oh, that one's doing well, but I was now concerned, obviously, that might have class 1 in it as well. Does it always go 1, 2, 3, 4? Have you ever seen any 1, 2, 3, 2 or anything like that? Or
I'm pretty sure it can. From my experience, it just follows that sequence. Matt, I don't know if you can come in on
that. So there's there's actually there's a few reports from around the continent where it can actually improve from one season to the next. So there's a recent paper from Germany as well showing that, and in France they saw like a decrease in the crown condition, and then it stabilized then. But I think because the issue is because there's so much environmental effects on the disease that, say, in those countries, I don't know if you have. So maybe up in Scotland it's not as much of an effect, but say in the south of England you have like a drier heat wave year, and I monitored like the fruiting production during those years, and the spore production, you just get so much less. So then if you have reduced infection that year, for example, it's less stress on the trees. But obviously you can see a change between the years. Some years they can pick up, some years they can decline. But that it's just the complexities of the process.
There's a point, I'm talking far too much here, but there was a point last year when I felt like a lot of ash trees were looking better than they'd looked for a while. Yeah. And I started to feel excited, and then the comment was made, that's probably a last flush, a last effort of propagation before the inevitable happens. And I hope that was a nice way to...
I mean, I'd echo that. There's a beautiful, one of the nicest specimens I've seen in just a Greenbank garden, and we thought that was just coming into stage 2, and it looks like it's gone back to stage 1, but that's persisted for about 2 years now, Matt. and it's not
Yeah.
changed. So
yeah, it's I think yes, it's such a complex it's such a complex process of what actually determines the survival of a tree, and it's something that we haven't unpicked as to how many are actually going to die from Ash Dieback, which is why I'm glad that, like Simon covered in his talk, because there's a question to chat about felling ash trees, and that obviously from a safety perspective, when you get the roots, when you get the rot at the base, when you get honey fungus, then that is what kills a lot of the mature ash.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at like a decline, then if you find the honey fungus, then it's on its way out. But yeah, so I mean, really, yeah, it's a case of if it's not hazardous to people, if you can, then leave it and see how it progresses, and maintain that diversity to combat future threats as well, and allow natural selection.
Fascinating. I should dip in occasionally to the questions. Sorry. There is a question probably for Simon, actually. Is there grant support for landowners to fell roadside trees? Is this something you've come across? Is it at landowner expense or?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know. I'll be quite honest with you. It's not something I've managed to get. But there are grants for felling. I mean, roadsides, I'm not too sure because it's all about ownership.
Yeah.
When you move into your own land, I think it's a little bit different. There'll be grants for that. But roadside stuff, I just don't know, and I don't want to give the wrong answer there.
Yeah, cool. No problem. A couple of things you might have possibly touched upon a little bit, but just come to you, Matt. Have you noticed any significant differences in infection rates between woodland ash, a more isolated hedgerow, or roadside? So was it anecdotally you were suggesting perhaps roadside more than woodland ash, or is that incorrect? Was that just what I've seen?
So at lower ash density, you're typically going to get less infection or less severe disease progress because you get less of those. You've effectively got a lower density of fruiting bodies and less spore infection. But it's not just the immediate location of the tree that matters. It's the ash within the surrounding few hundred meters, because you can get spore clouds blown from neighbouring ash woodlands. And then obviously, so that's one factor. And then obviously you've got other stresses on a tree, like maybe being by a roadside with possible root compression isn't the best place for a tree, because we know that vigorous trees do best with the disease. So it's one of many factors, but from France, they found that it had much slower progress in more isolated trees.
Oh, how interesting. There's a great comment here, Richard Bellamy, about mistletoe kiss, and which is the fragments of mature trees. Given climate shift, are we talking about new things coming to this? Mistletoe kiss was not a phrase I'd heard before, but I don't know if that's crossed either of your desks.
I've not heard mistletoe kiss, but mistletoe is Viscum album, which is a semi-parasite on is it oaks? I can't remember.
Oaks and apple or something.
Oaks and apples, I again, sorry to say I don't know, but I don't know. I've no idea on that one. I mean, maybe is it getting more of a foothold on as a parasite? It's beginning to colonize too many trees. Clearly, it is from Richard's comment. So I'll look into that. So thank you, Richard. That's education for me today.
And a question I shall ask is a question here about Sitka spruce. I don't know whether you've got quite a lot of Sitka spruce in Dumfries and Galloway at the moment, you could say. And the question is has it crossed your desk in terms of diseases we've heard of? Is it the Ips beetle, I think, isn't it? The spruce and things. So
from my point of view, it's Ips that's the main thing. That's what's been monitored. So
in your world, Matt, is there research going on behind the scenes that we can take comfort from on this, or is
so from my perspective, we've been doing so I've not been doing research into Ips. We were doing research into emerald ash borer beetle. But it sort of goes back to the previous question, kind of about Dutch elm disease and Ash Dieback, and it's sort of how we've moved more from a reactive to a proactive standpoint. Like, for example, on that pest that isn't here yet, we're doing research on locations we can survey to try and detect it early, how we can maximize detecting it early, possible biological control agents we can use to control the beetle, things like that. But for Ips, I don't know, but I do know that they were doing surveys informed based on weather data and modelling. But I don't know much more than that about Ips myself. But sorry.
Sorry, Matt, talk over you. I think one of the most interesting things is when we look at our wider landscapes, you find that they're dominated by very few species. And I think that is the biggest problem that we have, is we have an overabundance of larch Sitka spruce dominating our landscapes. They're incredibly worried about any pathogens coming in because that has commercial value. And so for me, and gardens are still the same, design landscapes still have this. Arduni was a monoculture of one Japanese larch. So I think it's a case of, when we replant, it's diversity and resilience we need to build into these collections, as well as having the commercial value that we clearly need from a timber industry, which is why, going back to that point I made, McNab, of look at these forest gardens, look at what was planted in those gardens in the 1930s, and we will get some of the answers to our problems there. Because, my understanding is, for something like sequoias, the redwoods, they need hot smoke in order for the seeds to dehisce. Many conifers are fire adapted species, and so far we don't have those forest fires in the UK, and especially in the west coast of Scotland. Therefore, are some of these other trees not more suitable for timber, for carbon sequestration, and for disease management within our woodlands?
Right. There's a question here. Sort of summarising both your presentations to an extent. If we are planning a woodland or managing a woodland in Dumfries and Galloway or further afield, any key tips that we can take? And so, in Matt, in your presentation, you were talking about density, you were talking about variety of species. Was there any work about undergrowth management and things like that? Was the points? Or
no, there isn't. So, what's sort of lacking at the moment is, I guess, what can be done with woodlands at the moment, because like I said, it's been very much a reactive thing. What I would say is, it's advice on, say, if you have a large range of woodlands where you're going to prioritize your surveys, really you get that advice to say, you prioritize, mortality is going to be higher where you've got a higher ash density and where a site is wetter, and it's less concern on where you've got a lower ash density and it's not necessarily as wet a site. So yeah, in terms of management, it's more about where you would survey at the moment rather than actions you can take.
Okay, fascinating. I'm so struck. Was it 1976? Did you say suspected when it was actually arrived here? Was that right?
78. They found a record from the Tallinn Botanic Gardens, I believe it was, in Estonia. So yeah, very much on the back foot.
Yeah. It leaves you wondering quite what else is amongst us at the moment that we haven't possibly picked out, but we won't dwell on that. There's a really good question here for Tim about regional differences. And sorry, in the last couple of minutes here, I just want to start wrapping up now, but about regional differences, sort of England, Scotland, and what factors influencing that. And I think that I would love to tie that to a question possibly to you both, and also to see regional responses and see if there's been anywhere you think that has proactively responded or better responded, or have. I mean, the impression I got was that it's travelled north. Is that right, Matt? Is that from what you...
So, well, it's introduced through it's general east to west spread, but that kind of oversimplifies it, because at the same time we had east to west arrival from the continent, but then we had plantings at different locations around the country. So it was actually again, the history of the disease is really uncertain as well.
So it's not a case that someone's had longer to get to respond or get used to responding than anywhere else. It's
not necessarily, and also we don't really have the. The issue really is we don't have we don't have lots of survey data from different regions to do those studies. So I did, like I said, I built a model for Ash Dieback then to see how it influences emerald ash borer, but I was using, those parameters and survey data that we have from the continent and environmental effects, because I didn't have anything in the UK to sort of just to validate that to work with.
Yeah. Okay. So there hasn't been but any regional differences that you've seen in terms of climate within the UK or?
Within the UK, I can't say, but I would. But the thing that is really clear is that ash that's higher density on wet sites, moist soil sites, that's much worse affected.
Okay.
And higher precipitation values, that's worse affected as well. So moisture, higher ash density, that's like the larger scale landscape stuff.
Have you seen
less heat wave days.
Sorry. Have you seen anything, Simon, in your estate of difference or variation? Or
I just almost echo what Matt says. It is worse in the sort of west coast for us, but then there's large pockets in the northeast which are equally as bad. But what we tend to find to make that sort of correlation is just it depends on the density of ash that were planted when these big estates were created. And that kind of dictates dictates it all. So, for example, in Crathis in the northeast, Crathis Estate, they have lots of ash trees that were planted all roughly about the same time. It's a very enclosed woodland, so the moisture level is quite high. So you tend to find that it spreads quite a lot. So it's just kind of echoing what Matt says, but and they've come in from all different angles. So it's really hard to make a sort of a strapline statement to say yes, there are clear variations, because there's so many factors involved here.
Wow, what an absolutely perfect line to end the event on, because I think that's some of the biggest thing I've taken away from tonight is there's a complexity within the complexity in this particular subject. And so very, very grateful to hear from Matt, to hear the sort of national picture and the background to Ash Dieback's arrival, and then fascinating to hear Simon's interpretation from a landowner point of view and actual managing ash. So thank you so much to Simon and Matt. I'm reliably informed there is a round of applause going on around houses across the UK right at this moment. And so we actually have, this is the second event in 3 events of Knowledge November. The third event, I'll look at seamless technology, is next Tuesday evening, Woodland History Detectives. We've got Coralie Mills, Dr. Coralie Mills, talking about what assets and what digital assets and resources can be used to try and uncover the history of a woodland. This event's been recorded, and we'll do a little bit of polishing and we'll post it on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much to everyone that's attended. Thanks so much, National Lottery Heritage Fund, that made it happen. But particular thanks to Matt and Simon. Really, really interesting to hear both perspectives. And I think there we shall end the event. Thank you all so much for coming.